Welcome, you're watching Kaleidoscope Srilanka Life News Capsule. According to a newly published report by IFC, Sri Lanka leads South Asia in women in banking, but significant challenges remain. While we are ahead of the rest of our South Asian peers, the number of women at board level is 27% only, as opposed to Nepal's 20% and Bangladesh's 14%. This is especially interesting considering that 46% of new recruits in Sri Lanka are women. So the question remains, where are women at a disadvantage? Here to help us face facts is gender lead for IFC Sri Lanka, Aarthy Arunasalam. She was the lead in compiling the IFC's report on women's advancement in banking in emerging South Asian countries. Aarthy, welcome to the show. Now, the obvious question is, what do women bring into the banking sector?
Having more women as employees and as leaders does lead to multiple business performance metrics, better reduced risk management, and also increased ability to attract new customers. This also translates, when you have more women bankers as leaders, it translates into having more return on equity, close to 33%. For Sri Lanka, we conducted a study on the women on boards in the Colombo listed stock exchange listed companies, and the study results mirrored more or less the same. What's also interesting to note is when you look at the stock prices, and especially the stock prices increases when you have more women as leaders, from 1% to 1.65% on the day of disclosure.
What were the key findings in your study?
What we did was, for the first time in the emerging South Asia countries, we conducted a study to understand what are the key barriers for women in the banking sector industry to come into the workforce, drive in as leadership roles, and also to kind of thrive and accelerate in the equality space as well. What we also noticed was that there wasn't a data-driven approach that was available amongst the emerging South Asia, and the countries being Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. So we did a study with close to 4,600 employees across 20 banks in the 3 countries. And for Sri Lanka, it was 1,000 employees across 7 banks. 41% of the market share was the banking sector. When we look at it more broadly of the 3 countries, Nepal was leading when it came to women representation, and Bangladesh was quite significantly lagging behind. We also noticed that when you look at the South Asia average amongst the 3 countries, we were at 30%, but way lagging behind the global average of 52%. And then when you kind of dive deeper into the Sri Lankan businesses and what in the banking sector, what we noticed was 40% of the women, there's high women representation in the entry level, but as you move into the middle management and then into the senior management, this significantly drops, which is what we call as the broken rung.
Any surprises in your research?
When you look at overall women representation for Sri Lanka, it was 38%. And then what we did notice is that the broken rung does continue. But what was interesting for Sri Lanka, and it stood out, was we had a higher representation of women in new recruits at the entry level, and we also had a higher representation of women on boards. But I'm sure you would have come across these phrases saying that, but we don't have enough women who can take up senior leadership roles, or we follow a meritocracy policy, but there aren't any women in the market, right? So what was interesting to see is that 70% of the women believe that they are ready to take up senior leadership roles. So at some point there is a career mismatch from their aspiration or the ability to kind of be equal in terms of parity with men. What was also interesting to see is that 78% of the men do not believe that having more women as leaders churn to business results.
What are the major obstacles that stand in a woman's way in getting up that ladder in this particular context of this industry?
So the first is the social cultural constraints. So what we did notice is that 40% of women face household challenges and 20% of women face barriers around care responsibility, and they did mention that having a career has negatively impacted them. So, and it was also interesting to notice that when it comes to mobility and also traveling to a different location, there were family restrictions that's actually constraining women to be in that particular role. On the other hand, we also, when we had conversations with senior leaders, especially senior women leaders, what we did notice is that many said that they were able to perform what they're doing right now was because they had a very supportive family or a spouse. The second key barrier is around lack of fair evaluation. So what we have noticed is that 1 out of 4, men or women, equally say that they don't believe that they're being fairly evaluated. So when we dive a little deeper and when we saw what are the nuances that's coming majority for women, is that it was clear that when it comes to confidence and how you kind of portray yourself in the organization, women, or more than half the women, said that they do face microaggression or the ability to kind of be interrupted when they're speaking or things like that is a key barrier for them to perform at their fullest potential. And at the same time, it's not creating an enabling environment for them to thrive as well.
So what are Sri Lankan banks doing right, if at all, in this sphere?
One thing that was really coming out strongly is that we're doing something right at the entry level to recruit more women, and we're doing something right at the board level, right? And when you look at the policies and practices, all banks have a very strong DE&I policy and very much focused on thriving and creating an enabling work environment. But I must also highlight probably a few banks who have done a few initiatives that has enabled them to accelerate more women in the banking sector more broadly. So one being Standard Chartered Bank, who has introduced unconscious bias training for the leaders so that it kind of creates an equitable work environment for both men and women, which is something that could be replicated in other banks as well. We also have very strong performance related matrix and creating a feedback mechanism where the managers are also being trained on certain manners, is where HNB and HSBC are also banks that are following it. It's very important to have an enabling ecosystem, and this is where regulators need to come into play and hold banks accountable. I think we have progressed to kind of move in that lens. If I were to kind of highlight, Nepal has multiple or leads when it comes to having positive regulatory reforms by having more women in the banking sector compared to the rest of the countries. However, Bangladesh very recently implemented a mandatory quota to have at least one non-executive board member just a couple of days ago. So I think this is definitely an inspiration for Sri Lanka to move from a progressive quota that we already have at the Colombo Stock Exchange more towards hard, bold bets or a mandatory quota per se. And also, Savithri, if you notice, like most of the global countries, whoever has progressed in this particular manner has made those bold bets. So I think as a country, it's high time we come together and make use of this opportunity and use the report as key inputs, because it has highly scientific data driven approach that's there, and push the needle towards where we had to head to.
Kaleidoscope is on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe, follow and like us.
You focus on your goals. We will take care of the risks. Srilanka Life.